let's talk perfectionism. Usually, most of the time when I say perfectionism, people know what I'm talking about, but let me take a moment to explain it just in case you don't. When I'm talking about perfectionism, I'm not talking about a drive or a desire to do well. I'm talking about a high level of anxiety and pressure that people put on themselves to achieve perfectly, and when they are unable to or can't, they beat themselves up, they feel super anxious, and when they reach that achievement of whatever they were trying to go to, rather than feeling a sense of satisfaction, they push the bar up higher. Let me give you a super simple example. Perfectionism is not, hey, I really want to get an A in this course. Perfectionism is, if I don't get a 98% in this course, then I'm going to feel super anxious and be extra distraught for a very long period of time. When I do get the 98% in the course though, rather than being proud of myself and impressed, I'm going to write it off of saying, well, it wasn't 100% or the course must have been really easy, that's why I got a 98. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about perfectionism. It's this really strong pressure that we have to do everything perfectly. So let's talk about what's really at the root of this. And if you follow me, you know where I'm going with this. Often at the root of perfectionism is trauma. And perfectionism is a really clever coping mechanism with trauma. Let's trace it back to childhood. Let's say you grew up in a home that says you're not good enough. That's the message that you're inherently sent, whether it's directly said or whether it's kind of implied or whether it's said to somebody else in your family, a sibling, for example. What you might have done in order to feel a little bit better and to cope with this feeling of inadequacy, of not good enoughness, is you realize, well, if I do everything perfectly, if I do it at the super high level, then that proves that I am good enough. Then that proves that I am worthy. Clever, right? We also see people using perfectionism as a way to protect themselves from getting in trouble. If I get a 98% on my test, then mom and dad can't be mad at me. If I clean my room to absolute perfection, then my parents, they'll have nothing to yell at me about. So it's a way to take care of ourselves and protect ourselves. What's really important in what I'm saying though, is that at the core of perfectionism, we actually understand that there's a feeling of inadequacy or worthlessness. And the belief is that if I achieve at a certain way, if I do something right, then I won't be worthless. What's really important and what's really hard to understand about perfectionism is that this, of course, is not going to work. That if we have this feeling of not good enoughness in us, we are always going to be striving, always going to be pushing to do more, but as soon as we reach it, it's still not enough because it's not about the outside surrounding things. Something that some people seem to get a little stuck on when it comes to perfectionism is that you do not have to be a perfectionist in all areas of your life to be someone who is a perfectionist, so to speak. So for example, I've been using the example of grades. That might be where someone finds that they're a perfectionist, but they might find in other areas of their life that they don't care if they're a perfectionist. We usually find that the ways in which we feel the requirements to be a perfectionist are connected to the trauma that we've experienced. So if the trauma was around your parents, for example, yelling at you for a bad grade, then your perfectionism might be around grades. But if your parents maybe got you in trouble for not being manly enough, obviously that would be, we have a whole different conversation there. But let's say that's what they get you in trouble for, not being manly enough, then you might find that you're a perfectionist in things that your parents would have considered manly. So maybe it's sport playing, for example. You have to be perfect at that because then that overcomes the trauma that you've experienced. So how perfectionism can show up can look a little different for some people, that it might kind of go in just one area of your life and not all of them. But we know with perfectionism, there comes this real feeling of inadequacy, this feeling of not enoughness that we then try and compensate for. So let's start by sprinkling a little bit of compassion, because this coping mechanism of perfectionism was actually a fantastic way of coping in the environment that you grew up in. This is so clever for a young person to realize, hey, if I do this, then I won't be in trouble. It's such a brilliant survival tactic. But I'm guessing that if you're a real perfectionist, that real deep drive to do better, it's freaking exhausting. And I speak from experience because I, for sure, 1000% was a perfectionist and struggled so hard with this belief that if I get anything wrong, that actually means I'm a failure. It's very black and white for me. Either I'm perfect or I'm a failure. There was no shade of gray. It's exhausting being a perfectionist. And so when I think about perfectionism, we obviously need to talk about, well, what are we going to do about it? There's a couple different approaches depending on kind of what lens of counseling or what theory of counseling you like. One approach is that we need to kind of go back to the attachment wounds, or the people who made us believe that we are not enough the way that we are. We need to go back internally and heal those wounds. So that would be kind of inner child work, for example, kind of moving into those wounds, kind of recovering from them a little bit. That would be an attachment lens to it. Kind of more of a behavioral approach, which can be really, this one can be fun, but also terrifying. Fun in the sense that it's very task-driven, which perfectionists tend to quite like task-driven things. This one can be great for that. A behavioral approach would really say, can we choose something that feels safe that we could try to not be perfect at? Can we not be perfect at it? And can we see if the feared outcome happens? So let's say that for you, you need to be an absolute perfectionist at keeping your house tidy, that if anything is out of place, you feel like a complete failure. A behavioral approach would say, well, let's leave something out of place on purpose. And let's guess what our mind is saying would happen if we leave it out. So if I leave the dishes undone for a night, what is gonna happen? What we do is we then do that thing and we see if the bad thing happens. This helps our brain kind of learn, hey, this isn't always true. This one, it's super beneficial. It can be a little bit hard because it's terrifying to do the very thing that you're telling yourself it's not safe to do. And it doesn't always heal the wounds that caused it, but it can help kind of break us free from our perfectionist patterns. So those are a couple options. We can heal some attachment wounds. We can take it from more of a behavioral aspect. And another way that I really like to kind of work with perfectionism is working on building that sense of worthiness. How we do that might look a little bit different for some people. Sometimes, again, it's like that first option of going back to learning when did we not have that. And sometimes it's about building up a feeling that we already do have it. So noticing areas where we are already succeeding and doing well. I am going to jump in right there and say that we have to be careful with this approach, because when we are a perfectionist who feels that we have to do well, sometimes when we're building up a sense of I am worthy as is, we get really focused on the externals. We get focused on what things have I done that show that I am worthy. And when we want to build up that worthiness to combat the perfectionism, well, if we're just choosing different things to show I'm worthy over here, that's not going to work. So we really do need to be focusing on building up an internal sense of worthiness. So there you have it. There's a little bit of a discussion around what we understand in the trauma world that perfectionism is really about, and then maybe a couple ideas of ways that you might be able to start untangling that.